A couple weeks ago, I made a boba B-roll sequence with my phone and filmed a behind the scenes. Now I'm gonna break down how I edited that video in Premiere and After Effects and why I made those choices. Let's watch the video with my editing timeline. The top left is the original footage and the right is the final edit. For the first shot with the water, because I speed ramped this shot, there sometimes wasn't enough motion blur, so I added pixel motion blur to fix that. I also added a mask on this so that the middle of the water was sharp, but the outside where there was that swishy motion was blurred. For the stove shot, I used point tracking stabilization to lock on to different points in the frame. When you're motion tracking, the biggest thing is probably to choose the right point to track on. You want to put something in the little box that is pretty easy to follow, like the dot on the stove here. That way, when After Effects searches in the big box for where that dot is, it's able to find it in the next frame. I moved the tracking point a couple times to different objects because the shot is sweeping back and I wanted to lock onto something else. I did this by dragging the tracking box by its edge, which offsets the tracking point so you can use another object to stabilize. That way when you hit apply, you have one continuous motion, but you won't see a giant jump to another part of an image. For the angle that was inside the bubbling water, I really liked the splashes and then the part where we go underwater. But they were too far apart to speed ramp together, so I made a hard cut and a transition. To match the two shots, I stacked them on top of each other and turned down the opacity of one of them so that I could move it and line it up to exactly the same position as the other one. Then all I did was crossfade the second clip in right at the middle of the transition. Then I created an adjustment layer and added a transform effect. Anything you do to an adjustment layer will apply to all of the layers below it. So I zoomed in and keyframed a motion down to match going down into the water. I also added motion blur to the shot. For the next clip, my goal was to focus on the contrast of the steam and the swirly motion that I thought looked really cool. One thing that I did with this shot that I've been practicing is thinking about the purpose of a clip throughout the process, like when planning, filming, and editing. Sometimes I feel like no matter how hard I try, my videos are still missing something, and I think purpose is often that something. With this shot, I wanted the swirly motion and the brightness of the steam to stand out. I used speed ramping in Premiere so that it slowed down on the beat and at the points where I thought were important. I smoothed out the speed ramps as well. Without thinking about what I wanted about this shot and why, I wouldn't have been able to do it. Here's the final shot. Here, I cut the music to a different part of the song. I've already put markers at the different beats, so all I have to do is line them up and fade the audio together. If the timing is right, it should sound like there's no cut at all. I do this a lot in my videos because I like to build towards different moments and control the flow of the music to be where I want it to. The next clip I think shows how important choosing the right part of a clip is. I had a really long slow-mo clip to go through and figure out what was the best part. I knew I wanted something that showed the bubbles and had a different angle than the previous shot. The way I choose which parts of a clip I want is I use the cutting tool in Premiere, and I take the parts that I like and drag them up to the next track. So then when I look at my timeline, I can see exactly what I liked. Sometimes I move clips up even higher to be like, Henry, seriously, do not forget, use this clip. Okay, so for this clip, why did I choose the part that I did? When I saw this part, I noticed that the water was really shiny around the boba, and right away that stood out to me. And at that point, we have just zoomed into it, and so that's the clear focal point, so I knew that that was the part that I wanted. The previous shot was a wide view of the boiling, so it fits nicely to move in tight and see this one spot that pops out that we haven't seen yet. I speed ramped so that it slowed down when the focus is right there. I added a little bit of zoom blur to the beginning, and I color graded to help make it really pop. When you're editing, I think it really helps to have everything connected like that. Another way I help connect the clips together is with sound effects. For the entire boiling part, I had a bubbly sound effect in the background. Then I added sound effects that were specific to each clip, like splashes and the steam. Then I added whooshes and other sound effects that went along with the motion of the shots. As you can see, a lot of my sound effects overlap, which I think helps with the flow of the video. Instead of it just being like all the sound effects for one clip and then all the sound effects for the next clip, they're kind of all blended together. At first when I was editing, I was thinking about removing this part of the song that's more quiet. But then I realized it felt right to have this calmer part kind of build up to the epic beat drop. So I decided to edit 3 shots together to match the beats of the music. Now we've reached the epic beat drop, and I wasn't really happy with this shot because it took me so many tries to get it right that I used way too much lychee syrup. I also didn't really like how shaky my movements were, so I stabilized the shot and it still looked pretty bad, so I moved it around at a couple points so that it looked better and added a lot of directional blur. I used keyframes to make the directional blur smoothly ramp up and down with the motion of the shot so that it looked realistic. The next shot I just added warp stabilizer. For the next clip, I speed ramped to slow down at the straw drip and the splash. Then I added a slow zoom in to focus on the action in the shot. I spent most of the time on this clip though on the color grading. When I mixed the tea and the milk and the lychee syrup, it turned out this gross yellowy color, so I decided to fix that in color grading. I went into the hue saturation curves and used the eyedropper tool to pick out the color of the drink. That way the edits I made will only apply to that color. With the yellows isolated, I then turned their saturation down. Next, I went into the hue versus hue panel. By the way, the versus thing just means like hue versus saturation means you are selecting a specific hue and then you're changing the saturation of that specific hue. So now in hue versus hue, I'm selecting a specific color, the yellows, and changing them to a different hue. You want to be careful with this because it can make the colors look pretty wacky, so I decided to make it just a little bit more orange as opposed to yellow. The last adjustment I made was in the color wheel panel. I made the shadows of the entire image more purple. So now with the final look, I think the colors look a lot better. I also copied these changes to all the clips after this one too. The next shot is the wide stirring shot, and I added a slow zoom into this one just like the previous shot so that it feels kind of continuous. Next is the stirring and pan down transition. This was originally 2 shots, one where the boba was popping up to the surface and then one where I was stirring and then panning down. But I decided to transition them together because they looked too similar to just have a hard cut there. The first thing I did, exactly the same as the previous transition, is line up the shots at the point where I wanted to cut. Then I used an adjustment layer to transform both of the clips so that we end with the second shot entirely in frame. But because of the framing of the shot, there was a lot of empty space. So I used a tool in After Effects called Content Aware Fill. This fills space with pixels based on what's already in the frame. You can use it to cover up objects or, like in this case, to extend the edge of a clip. I removed the transform effect and then zoomed out and then created a huge content aware fill with all of the empty space. Then I took that fill, which is just the blurry outline, and I moved it to line up with that first shot. So all the movements and blur I add will be to both of those. So that fixed the empty space in the first clip, but the second clip also had some empty space. So I did the same thing and created more fills. Then I turned on motion blur for the transformation. I used a cross dissolve to blend the clips together in the middle. Because it's so fast and there's motion blur, you can't really tell that I've used a bunch of little content aware fills and added them. That's where you want to be careful because content aware fill can look extremely obvious if it's not used right. In this case, since there's a lot of blur and motion, that hides the fact that I've used content aware fill. But if I just put the fill there, then you would know immediately, oh, that's fake. So then I nested that whole thing, which is like collapsing everything inside of one clip or a composition in After Effects. I made a copy of that and then cranked up some radial blur. Then I masked that onto the original. I made sure the blur was only over the stirring motion. Then I added a vertical direction blur as we're panning down too. Here's the final shot. Now we're at the last shot where I used After Effects point tracking stabilization again. Again, choosing what point to stabilize on is extremely important. I chose this group of dots because it's pretty distinct. After Effects probably won't randomly confuse it with another point. It stabilized pretty well, so all I really needed to do was zoom in and rotate a little bit. Next, I animated a radial zoom blur for the very beginning of the transition. This is exactly the same as I did with all the other blurs, where it comes in and then out smoothly. When I was color grading this clip, I noticed something interesting. At the bottom left, I had my color light shining blue light, and at the top right was my white light, but it was giving off sort of a purple glow. So in color grading, I decided to play off of that and have kind of a blue side and a purple side symmetrically framing the image. First, I created a new Lumetri color effect, and I masked it to the top right, so the color changes I make will only apply to that area. I feathered the mask so that it would fade out smoothly. Then I went to the color wheel panel and made the shadows of that area more purple. Then I created another Lumetri color effect, this time masked to the bottom left, and then I made the shadows more blue. This is what it looked like before any color grading, and this is the final shot. For the sound design for the last two clips, I started out with just splash effects. Then I added a stirring sound effect, which is actually the sound that I recorded of stirring liquid with a whisk for my Cinnamon B-roll video. I added some ambient water sounds to play in the background the whole time. Then I added these water whoosh sound effects that I think sound really cool. I added some Foley, like more splashes and little glass tinkles. Finally, I added whooshy and boomy sounds to finish everything off. Here are the last two shots with all the sound effects. Now let's watch the whole sequence, but without music and only listening to the sound effects. So that's how I edited my Boba Smartphone B-roll. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments and I'll help you out. I hope this was helpful and thank you for watching.